Here's an example of an American Folklore podcast and what the script would also look like. This is called The Baker's Dozen. Have you ever wondered why This is an example of the American Literature Podcast assignment. This is the podcast itself, the recording, along with the script. The Baker's Dozen. Have you ever wondered why a baker's dozen of something has 13 instead of 12? Where did this come from, and how did it catch on? The story actually takes place in a little upstate New York bakery many, many years ago. My name is Angie Chambliss, and this is the story of the Baker's Dozen. Many years ago in the upstate New York town of Albany, there lived a baker. He had a great life, a great business, and he did really well in his shop. He was blessed with customers who came from miles around to purchase his goods. One evening, as the baker was getting ready to close up his shop, an old woman entered and stared at him across the counter. "A dozen St. Nicholas cookies," was all she said. The baker peered over the counter at the woman and wondered if she was the one he'd heard about. He boxed up 12 cookies and gave them to her with a smile. She opened the box and frowned over it at him. "There are only 12, she demanded. "I asked for a dozen, so there should be 13. The baker's smile faded, and he stared at the old woman. "A dozen is 12, he said tightly. He'd heard of this happening around town, and there had been rumors of the baker's misfortunes, so he refused the old woman's 13. He would not be taken advantage of, and his stare turned to a glare, and he repeated that 12 is a dozen. The old woman dropped the box on the counter. When she got to the door, she turned back, made a gesture with her hands, and muttered some words in a language the baker didn't understand. He was angry that night, but his anger soon turned to confusion, then sadness. Everything he baked came out ruined, and the mishaps began to affect his business. Before he knew it, there were no customers coming into his shop at all. So that night he prayed to St. Nicholas to help him ward off this evil curse. The next day a man entered that shop, and the baker swore it was St. Nicholas himself. The man reminded the baker of the importance of charity and made him reconsider his position on the extra cookie. That very night the old woman returned and asked for a dozen St. Nicholas cookies. Luckily for the baker, that had been the only batch that had come out perfect in weeks. He boxed up 13 cookies and handed them to her. She looked into the box and smiled. With a wild gesture, she flung her hands in the air and said more indecipherable words. The baker could swear he felt the curse lifted, and the following day his business returned to normal as if nothing had ever happened. From that moment on, any time a customer ordered a dozen, they got a baker's dozen, which he knew was always 13. This story is one of the importance of charity for sure. The baker was being stingy with his goods, but on the other hand, it wasn't like he was refusing a starving man, and one has to wonder if the old lady's extortion wasn't its own lesson as well.